Hi there. I've been an Apple fan for a long time. In particular, the iPhone has been, I think, transformative for my life and for my career. But I'm increasingly starting to think about the fact that maybe the iPhone is leaving me behind. So I wanted to talk through some of those ideas in this presentation. Now, when I was at university, it took me a long time to get a mobile phone in the first place. When I finally did get a mobile phone, it was a Sony Ericsson. There was fairly limited functionality. There was actually a camera that you could plug into the bottom of that and you could take photos, but they were obviously incredibly low quality photos. After I did my undergraduate degree, I went to live in America and necessitated having a mobile phone because I didn't have a landline at the time. So I had a traditional American style mobile phone where most people in the States at the time weren't using text messages, so it was literally only used for phone calls. When I came back to the UK after I graduated, I remember thinking to myself, I'm just going to wait for Apple to make a mobile phone. I was so dissatisfied with the market at that time. I remember going several months without having a mobile phone. There was rumors that Apple were working on one. And then in 2007, to much fanfare, Steve Jobs announced the iPhone. And I made sure I got an iPhone as soon as I possibly could. Now, this was an incredible device. It was transformative. It was a major technological breakthrough in terms of the user interface in particular, but it also transformed, I think, the way in which we do business, and it set in line a lot of the products that Apple followed up with. Now, this is a slide that I used to use in my Incentives Matter lecture, where I'd make the point that value is multifaceted. I'd ask students to consider their smartphone, their internet-enabled smartphone, in many cases an iPhone, and think about the sources of value that are contained within it. Now, one of the things that you can do, one of the functionalities of an iPhone is that you can talk to people. And in its original conception, of course, this is a phone and that's the primary objective. You can also use it to write messages, so SMS or MMS messages. And ultimately, these are satisfying the needs that people have to communicate. So I try in my lecture to make the distinction between the functionality of the phone, which is to talk to people, to write messages, and the underlying need that consumers have, which is the need to communicate. Similarly, the iPhone allows us to listen to music. It allows us to watch videos. This satisfies the need to be entertained. An iPhone also allows us to take photos. This satisfies a need to remember events and also to make payments, which is a need to engage in exchange. So I try to make this point that the functionality is only valuable in the sense that it satisfies an associated need. And I also try and make the point that the needs that the iPhone satisfies don't necessarily belong together. So the needs to be entertained, to remember events, to engage in exchange, and to communicate can all be satisfied with different devices. The real source of the high value of the iPhone was by bundling those different needs together and satisfy them all at the same time with the same device. There's lots of graphics which demonstrate the importance and value of the iPhone. This is one that I found off the internet, which is showing all of the different things that the iPhone replaced. But what I'd like to do is to really think in more detail about what actually the iPhone replaced and whether or not that's still valid. Now, maybe this is individual. Of course, value is subjective. So some of these sources of value are going to be specific to me. But I also think they reflect a broader change in the landscape of this marketplace. So let's start off by looking at originally what the iPhone was supposed to replace. We've got there a normal camera, calculator, alarm clock, a landline telephone, an MP3 player, a portable gaming device, and a laptop, or that laptop could substitute for a desktop. And the iPhone came along, and all of a sudden, it takes on a lot of the functionalities of those objects. The ability to make phone calls, the answer phone capability. For me personally, visual voicemail was a major advantage of the iPhone. It's the reason why I've always been with O2 on the iPhone, because they have visual voicemail and they allow me to delete messages without having to dial a number to hear them. This was a major plus point of the iPhone, and yet I think we can all recognize that very few answer phone messages are things that we tend to listen to these days, And this is a point that I'm going to be making later on, the extent to which something like that was originally a very useful service remains so. And the alarm clock is obviously satisfied by the alarm clock app within the iPhone. There's a calculator app, of course, the cameras. We can think about email functionality in the iPhone, being able to surf the internet, do online shopping, be able to place bets, engage in instant messaging, the ability to play certain games. Remember when the iPhone first came out, and it was always very exciting when the App Store updated itself. You'd look and see which new games were available. Games such as Forensic and Drop 7, I remember playing a lot. There was games such as Angry Birds that became incredibly popular and people played a lot of. Over the years, the games became even more complex and realistic, and things like Grand Theft Auto and FIFA, I played a lot of on my iPhone, and the games began to closely resemble the type that you'd play, not on a mobile device per se, but actually becoming quite a close substitute for a video games console. Podcasts were an important part of the iPhone. That was something that I used to listen to on an MP3 player, but the iPhone completely nullified the need to have an MP3 player. Also, audiobooks is another example. Now, an interesting thing about the iPhone, I remember one of the most expensive apps I've ever had on an iPhone was the TomTom SatNav app. It was about £40–50 or something, which was an incredible large amount of money to pay for an app. And yet this was a GPS app that allowed you to use satellite navigation in the car. At the time, it was very popular to people either have a standalone device or to simply use the TomTom app on their iPhone, and that would be able to use SatNav in the car. I don't think many people use a TomTom app now. Again, this is another example of how successful the software that comes with smartphones have been. When Google Maps began to provide directions that became a close substitute for TomTom, basically took away the business model that TomTom had as an app provider for the iPhone or other smartphones, and Google Maps provided that functionality, which was incredibly valuable. Social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to some extent YouTube as well, are good examples of software that could have been used without smartphones. However, it's because of smartphones and because of the rise of the iPhone in particular that those apps have become so important. If we were only using Facebook on desktop devices, and there was a point where people did only use Facebook on desktop devices, then it wasn't as popular, it wasn't as immediate, it wasn't as something that you could integrate as easily with a camera. It's because of a smartphone that social media became so important and such an ingrained part of people's lives. Uber is another app which is something that you might be able to consider as existing independent of a smartphone, but it's really the smartphone itself that created the opportunity for the Uber app. Uber is something that is dramatically has value that's dramatically tied to the fact that the smartphone market exists. More recently, apps such as Spotify, so streaming devices for music, for film, algorithms that match your preferences to other music that you might like, giving you wide access to a large range of different cultural artifacts, platforms that connect people that create music and people that consume it. So I'm not just thinking of Spotify, but Netflix as well. Again, these are services that the value has been in large part spurred by the existence of smartphones and what's followed from Apple. Even more recently, if we look at the interconnected house, LiftX is an app that I use for light bulbs and for controlling speaker systems in my house. And this is something that, again, smartphones have enabled to a great extent. The ability to use your pocket, have a device that fits in your pocket, to be able to turn those devices on and off and control them, set schedules, a key role in the rise of those pieces of hardware has been the smartphone technology. Now, this is obviously a very crowded graphic, and you can see this to some extent tries to demonstrate the source of value within an iPhone, the fact that it achieves so many different objectives and satisfies so many different needs. It means that we no longer need to have MP3 players, we no longer need to have portable gaming devices, we no longer need to have sat-nav devices inside our cars, we no longer need to have cameras, calculators, alarm clocks. The question though is how far we can go with this and how many devices we are actually able to do without, given that we now have smartphones. We still do have landlines by and large, even though we don't necessarily need them or don't necessarily use them. For some reason, those landlines have remained. Also, even though we could, to some extent, anticipate not necessarily needing a laptop, people still seem to have laptops. They still seem to enjoy the fact that you have a functional keyboard that you can type into and a slightly larger screen size. So even though some of these technology treads on the toes of laptops and landline phones, we still tend to have them. The big game changer for me was the rise of the iPad. Now, I resisted a long time buying an iPad because I figured the whole point of an iPhone was that you didn't need one. It seemed to me that there wasn't a logical middle ground between an iPhone and a laptop. The main reason why I bought an iPad was because I wanted to grade exams electronically, and an iPad allows you to view an entire exam script without having to scroll, and also use a Apple Pencil to be able to annotate and leave feedback. Now, that was a principal and actually the sole reason that I bought an iPad. Once I did buy the iPad, though, I suddenly realized that there was a lot of the functionality of the iPhone that I now started to shift over onto that iPad. Since having an iPad, I've no longer used Netflix, no longer used video games on my iPhone. The screen size of the iPad is much more suitable to watching videos or playing video games. You can buy a controller that wirelessly syncs with an iPad. I used to originally play Fortnite using the touch screen on an iPhone. Now I play Fortnite using a PlayStation controller on the iPad. Also, when we're using the laptop, things like email, online shopping, internet, I find myself increasingly using laptop or my desktop computer at home for those activities than using a smartphone. Interestingly enough, most new cars now have an inbuilt sat-nav device. So in my old car, I had an immense amount of consumer surplus from being able to have a free Google Maps app that would allow me to find any directions that I needed. When I bought a new car, and this was several years ago now, but even then it came integrated with a sat-nav device that just works off a DVD that's playing in the car itself. But because that console is very visible, it's easy to see, it's touchscreen, it means I can still listen to my music on my iPhone, or I don't even need to have my iPhone with me in the car. I suddenly realized that I have no need for that sat-nav technology inside a smartphone. Also, social media. Now, the key driver, I think, of the rise of smartphones has been the rise in popularity of social media. But many of us are starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed by the use of social media. Some of us have detoxes where we go off social media for a while. And it was in an instance where I deactivated my Facebook account and I was off Twitter that I suddenly realized that a big important function of a smartphone, which is social media, was not actually giving me the value that I was hoping for. Once you go off social media, that takes away a large part of the value of a smartphone. Similarly, Spotify and LiftX, one of the major advantages and values of Spotify is the fact that it's a cross-platform device. So I can control Spotify on my laptop, I can control Spotify on my iPad. I don't need to have a separate device to access any of my music because everything is cross-compatible on cross devices. Similarly with LiftX, one of the big sources of value of LiftX devices is that this is voice controlled. So I have an Apple speaker in the house, and if I want to turn a light bulb on or off, if I want to do anything like that, then one option is to use the phone, but another option is simply to use voice command. The fact that we now have all of these smart speakers means that we do not need the actual handheld device to be able to utilize them. So Spotify and LiftX are something that I no longer need the iPhone to use. Going even further, as I mentioned before, very few people send answer phone messages these days. The answer phone capability is essentially worthless. Another interesting thing is that I quite like having an alarm clock. So there's something about having a physical object that's battery powered and not likely to run out of battery in the middle of the night that's nice to sit by the side of the bed. Many people don't like sleeping next to digital devices. So to the extent to which people use an old-fashioned alarm clock, then the alarm functionality of the iPhone becomes less valuable. Similarly, I like using calculators. So if I'm doing my accounts, I like to actually feel the pressure of the buttons. It gives me some pleasure and some joy. It makes me feel like I'm doing a better job. I very rarely use the calculator function on the phone. When it comes to the camera as well, I think there's a return to people wanting to actually use physical devices. Now, to some extent, this is an element of free riding. So I don't like having smartphones that are too big. So I still have an iPhone SE. One of the major downsides of that is the camera is not particularly high quality. However, the reason why I'm not too bothered about this is because whenever I'm in the type of social situation where I might want to have photos being taken, there's invariably somebody that does have a better quality smartphone and a better quality camera. There's no difficulty getting access to those pictures because if somebody takes a photo, you can simply ask them to share it, or you can go on a social media platform at some subsequent time and you can get a hold of it for yourself. Also, if I'm at an event where I might be dressed up quite smart and I think it would be quite nice to have a good photo of me, those events typically have professional photographers who are taking photos and they send you the copies afterwards as well. So to some extent, the only really reason that I take photos these days is to remember maybe the meals that I have whilst I'm traveling, but that's a relatively low feature, low function, and it doesn't require a particularly expensive camera. I'm starting to also think that maybe there's a return for an MP3 player. Mobile phones are getting so big now that if I ever had to replace my SE, I think phones that Apple are doing have such a big screen size, they become quite burdensome and difficult to carry. If I want to listen to podcasts and audiobooks, parts of me tempted to get a small iPod, which would fit in the pocket and never run out of battery, have very limited functionality, but provide the specific services that I need. If I did get an MP3 player on an iPod, then that would take away the need for an iPhone in order to listen to podcasts or to listen to audiobooks. In doing so, that might indeed mean the end of the iPhone and the death of the iPhone as a consumer product, at least for me. Question though is what's left, and it's those three apps, Uber, Betfair and WhatsApp, that I think are still keeping me to the iPhone. Ultimately, there's nothing that replaces the ease and convenience of being able to hail a taxi abroad if you're not quite sure where you are, if you don't have money in the local currency and you can't speak the language. So as far as I need to use Uber, I think the iPhone will stay in my pocket. Sometimes if I'm watching a football match live, if there's a goal that's been scored and it suddenly changes what I think is going to happen to the course of the game, and I want to make a very quick bet, there's no close substitute from being able to use my iPhone to log onto my Betfair account. And finally, instant messaging, to the extent to which people are locked into WhatsApp and having to use that as a means of staying in contact with people, it's very difficult to imagine a close substitute for that. I do have WhatsApp on my desktop computer and I prefer using it on my desktop computer, but there's something about having it in your pocket. The only other icon that's on the screen right now is the phone icon, and that's almost for emergency situations. It's difficult to imagine going to maybe on a family outing, taking the kids somewhere and not having the means to be able to phone loved ones or phone the police or phone ambulance or something in the event of an emergency. The point I'm trying to make though is that limited functionality doesn't necessitate everything that comes with the iPhone. If you think about the battery, the camera, the screen, if you think about the hardware elements of the iPhone, which Apple stress whenever they release a new iPhone, the battery, camera and screen have got relatively limited impact on the sources of value that we have for it, as far as I'm concerned. All of those things are moving the iPhone in the direction of being bigger and therefore also being more expensive. That's moving the iPhone away from the device that originally provided the value that I'd identified. I don't want to have to carry an iPad around with me wherever I go and rely on having a Wi-Fi network to be able to use Uber, Betfair or WhatsApp. So for as long as I need those devices, I probably need a mobile data connection and I'll probably continue using an iPhone. However, the point I'm trying to make is that when the iPhone first came on the market, it replaced a lot of products by providing a very unique mixture of different sources of value creation. There's nothing to say that those multifaceted sources of value creation should remain consistent or constant over time. We should expect that as consumers' needs change, and in particular, as different product devices come onto the market, such as the iPad, then and more appropriate or different bundles of needs are going to replace it. The iPhone is something that I have a lot of very high feelings towards, because I'd say it's probably the only device that I'm aware of in my lifetime that I would consider to be a genuinely transformative innovation. It's the only technological breakthrough in my lifetime where I can remember where I was when I saw it for the first time. And when I first saw it, I thought to myself, wow, this is going to change the world that I live in for the better. The fact that I'm increasingly starting to think that older technologies are more useful and that the iPhone is losing its way is therefore giving me a slightly pessimistic view about innovation around us. Thank you.